Senator Garou,
Here.
Senator Rothfuss, Senator Kinski, Senator Hicks,
Here.
Senator Craigo, or Representative Craigo, I apologize.
Here.
Representative Jennings, Representative Nyman,
Here.
Representative Oakley,
Excused.
Representative Olson,
Here.
Representative Rodriguez Williams,
Here.
Representative Stivar, Representative Stith,
Here.
Representative Washit,
Excused.
Representative Western, Representative Yin,
Here.
Representative Zwanitzer,
Here.
Chairman Summers,
Here. I think
Chairman
we have a
Driscoll.
couple more coming in. Did you get them down or?
We got
All
it.
righty. So Director, it looks like we've got some proposed amendments to joint rules, kind of a cleanup from having the COVID rules. So maybe you could go over all that for us?
Mr. Chairman, first proposed rule for the Joint Rules Committee to consider is the repeal of the joint rules of the Senate and House of Representatives 9-3, 11-3B, and 23-1. 9-3, Mr. Chairman, dealt with the authority of the Select Committee on Coal Mineral Bankruptcies to sponsor and introduce legislation during the 2020 budget session and 21 general session. Obviously, that by its very terms is obsolete now, and that select committee also no longer exists. So that's a cleanup to remove that. Joint Rule 11-3B states that the permanent rules of the 66th legislature don't need to be adopted until the 12th legislative day of the session. I explained this yesterday in House Rules. While there certainly wasn't a vaccine mandate on LSO staff, a lot of us chose to get vaccines. And so this allowed staff and those members who wanted to get the vaccinated and have that vaccine become effective before we went into session. And that fifth day of the 66th legislature was held virtually. And so thought it best, the Rules Committee at the time, not to have the rules adopted virtually. 2020 or 23-1, Mr. Chairman, deals with the 21 general session and primarily with the ability to appear remotely during that session. And again, by its terms, was limited only to the 2021 general session. So that's the cleanup of joint rules 9-3, 11-3B, and 23-1.
Thank you. And just to, excuse me, just to go over a little bit what the House did yesterday. And so what we decided to do is we are going to basically push out the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures to next week. And we'll probably, I think, try to do that in House Rules on Wednesday, which might allow us to look at that on in joint rules on Thursday. And we decided that based upon that, you had to get, some of the rules were kind of cleanups related to the manual, I would call it, or to conform, basically conform House and Senate and the manual. And we felt that we just kind of set those aside. So we set Joint Rule 10-1 aside as well. So our committee didn't look at it to make any kind of recommendation to the Joint Rules Committee. So that's kind of what we intend to do, is kind of do it next week.
Mr. Co-Chairman, we moved to coincide with you as well. So we've laid it back in the same time frame so that we can both kind of review at the same time.
Sounds good. I appreciate that. We had a whole House caucus and had the director there to go through the whole manual really really well, you know, I mean, we were all about to fall asleep, so I think it was a good exercise, though. And so I guess with that, I guess just to get some informal comments on the cleanup to the joint rules. Does anybody have any informal comments? And then I'll take I don't see any legislators out there, but then I'll take public comment, treat this just like an amendment in the bill. So are there any informal comments before I go to public comment? Nope. Is there any public comment on this rule change? Nope. Would anybody like to move this?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, please.
I move to repeal Joint Senate and House Rules 9-3, 11-3B, and 23-1.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to repeal Joint Rules 9-3, 11-3B, 23-1A and B. Any discussion?
Question.
Question having been called. Yep.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. Just the motion would include the C and D repeal as well on 23-1, which is on the second page. My apologies for interrupting, but just for
Yep.
clarification.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's all of it.
Right.
Yeah, it was included in the motion.
Correct. Thank you.
No worries.
All right. Question having been called. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We
Mr.
need to
Chairman?
do, we'll
Mr.
need to
Chairman?
do a roll call on that.
Okay, well, I do think Minority Floor Leader Rothfuss is correct in my motion. I said 23-1. It should have been 23-1 subsection A, subsection B, C, and D. Inclusive? All right.
Yeah, it was
We're
fine.
good. All right.
So I guess we'll take a roll call on this, because it has to be reported.
Senator Grew,
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss. Aye. Senator Kinski,
Aye.
Senator Hicks,
Aye.
Representative Craigo,
Aye.
Representative Jennings, Representative Nyman,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Olson. Aye. Representative Rodriguez Williams,
Aye.
Representative Stivar. Aye. Representative Stith,
Aye.
Representative Washit,
Aye.
Representative Western, Representative Yin,
Aye.
Representative Zawanitzer, Chairman Summers,
Aye.
Chairman Driscoll.
Aye.
All right. That passes. So now I guess we'd be at that order of business. If anybody had any joint rules they wanted to bring, it'd be the opportunity to bring that. So it looks like Representative Yin has, excuse me, has a joint rule. So Representative Yin, I'll turn it over to you to explain your rule.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I bring before you a Joint Rule 17-2 that I'm proposing. 17-2 in this handout that you've all been given, the intent here is to essentially move a little bit of that power of Management Council towards the chairman. So what I'm talking about here specifically is the interim topic process. So for those that don't know, which I think most of you do, the interim topic process is generally committee chairmen come together, the joint chairmen come together, come up with recommendations and present them to Management Council. Management Council decides from that recommendation what the final topics will be, as well as the number of days. So in the rule that I'm proposing, the idea would be that Management Council would no longer be able to remove topics, but would still be able to add topics that it thought were important. When I ran for the at-large Management Council seat at the previous year, one of the things that I thought was that Management Council had slightly more power than I felt comfortable with. So that's the reason that I bring this rule before you. The subsection B, the intent of that is to try to prevent Management Council from using its appropriation authority over the Legislative Service Office to prevent the number of days that interim committees would be able to meet. I think with some discussion from some of the other members of the House Committee, there's some confusion over the not more than 3 with the except at the above. I think the easiest thing that if the Rules Committee wants to move forward with this, to simplify this, if Management Council wanted to approve more days, it would be to strike additional and strike not more than. So that way, there would still be a default of 3 two-day meetings and 4 meeting days for select committees. And that is the joint rule that I'm proposing, and I stand for questions.
Any questions of Representative Yin? I guess not. Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yin, when you went through there and looked at these, particularly if these select committees were 4 meeting days for statutorily created select committees, did you do an analysis if any of the select committees currently meet more than 4 days?
Majority Floor Leader
Representative
Hicks.
Yin, go
Thank
ahead.
you, Mr. Speaker. Majority Floor Leader Hicks, what I did was I asked Matt Obrecht, how many days do select committees generally meet? And I used that as the default.
Senator
So,
Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just aware of the fact that particularly with Select Water and the way that they work with the Water Development Commission, they routinely meet more than 4 days a year in the capacity of Select Water. Actual meeting days is probably close to that, but the way that's structured, we meet with the Water Development Commission. One day is a commission meeting, and the next day is Select Water Committee. And the way I would read this, it would preclude them from the ability to continue to serve in that capacity as we currently do with our select committees.
Representative Yin.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. So the structure of the rule and the intent of it was to allow Management Council to approve more days if it saw fit. That's why I talked about striking additional and not more than, just to clarify that it does allow Management Council to approve topics and change the budget. So except as approved, you have a committee budget, but if the Management Council decides to approve more, it could do that.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks.
so I'm looking down on the end where it says Management Council as the amount necessary to facilitate not more than 3 two-day meetings for joint interim committees and 4 meeting days for statutorily created select committees. So the way I read that is currently structured, it says not more than 4 days for statutorily created select committees. If I'm reading that wrong, please show me where I'm not reading it correctly.
Representative Yin.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I would propose an amendment, if there's a motion and you guys decide to amend it, would be to strike not more than, and also strike additional, just to keep it a little cleaner on the intent and prospective action of how Management Council would work that. To set the default to that amount.
So Representative Yin, I have a question. I really think this will lead to more creep of days, more creep of dollars for meetings. And ultimately, how are we, Management Council also has to hire staff. We can't keep enough staff for the meeting days we have now, hardly. So why would we want to see creep? Because I believe this is going to cause more topics to be created and ultimately cost us more money in either personnel, if we can get the personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do think that having that set number of days means that committee would not be able to meet more than that without prior approval of Management Council. If they inject more topics than can be done in 3 days, it is still your prerogative to not approve more days. And I think Management Council still, even with removing topics in the past, has been slightly lax in approving more days, and I think that will still happen. But I think that is incumbent upon members of Management Council to resist approving those extra days.
Senator Rothfuss, with you first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leader Yin, I guess the question I have is with regard to intent, and you've got 2 separate paragraphs that I'm not sure the language matches the intent that I've heard. My understanding is the intent is to ensure that the committees have sufficient resources to study their topics. So it's almost, looking at the B paragraph, the intent is to ensure that management council doesn't limit the budgets of a standing committee to preclude them from having 3 two-day meetings. Is that the intent, is to ensure that there's sufficient funds for 3 two-day meetings and that the management council can't defund a committee as a means of precluding them from doing their work?
Representative Yen.
Mr. Speaker, I think, Minority Floor Leader, that is correct. The intent is to keep the Management Council from still running over the committee chairman if the committee chairman have topics that Management Council doesn't like, that keeps them from defunding the committee. So at the minimum, they would have 3 two-day meetings.
Co-Chair Driscoll.
Got it.
Do you have a follow-up? No, go ahead. Mr. Chairman, I'm a little with everyone else. I question whether that's what it's actually going to do in a lot of ways. Is from my experience, which hadn't been that long on the management council, more than holding back topics, what they've done is actually added some topics to it. I haven't seen a whole lot. And when I read section A, it's got a shall in there. And it says if the joint interim wants to bring 19 topics, the management council has no say. And, you know, sometimes you run into a deal, you've got chairman that'll oversubscribe, and we've seen that often. Representative Summers and I got into it now, Speaker Summers, I believe last year when we were doing it, and he said, look, your committee's taking on way too much. And the choice they gave us wasn't, we're going to do it for you. It was figure out how to cut it back because we don't think you can get it done. And I really dislike a shall that says, and I understand where you're at, that occasionally it comes. But the flip side of it is I've seen management council actually run bills and dictate things that committee chairman didn't want. And I think it's a deal that you've got to trust the management council is going to make the decisions. And sitting through it last year and coming to a couple before as a chairman, I think they've tended to do what you're attempting to do without trying to legislate it, is they really cut back and usually got a chairman that doesn't get everything they want, but they get their primary subjects. I can only ever remember once a primary subject getting cut back by management council. Somebody can correct me if they've seen more of it. But the way it is, I stand above it, both sections, but if it proceeds ahead, I'll divide it and try to kill them one at a time. Thank you.
Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. President, I mean, I think that is the prerogative of the Rules Committee. I may bring it to the floor if it does not pass Rules Committee, but it would still require someone to bring it on the Senate side, right? Because it's a joint rule.
Senator Rothfuss, did you have something else? Did I cut you off on a follow-up? Senator Hicks?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker and Representative Yen, I've always shared your concerns. In fact, I've actually co-sponsored the bill with a number of members of both houses because of the very issue that you addressed, is sometimes management council. And I can think of several times in the past, in my time in the legislature, has served more as an overbearing landlord of the legislators. And I think they were heavy-handed, quite frankly. And so I've always shared that concern. And it's like everything, trying to address Senator Driscoll's concerns. There's also a tremendous amount of experience, you know, and knowledge on management council. So how do you thread the needle of a shall not or a shall? And I just would like to ask you a question. What would you think of the idea, because of my shared concern that you have, but also the ability to weigh in with some of that experience that you have with management council? How would you think about, say, limiting that the management council can't pull the top 2 or 3 topics by the committee off the list? And so, again, it's trying to balance that, what's really the highest priority for that committee. You know, those committee chairmen work those issues as hard as anybody. They know them, they do interim committee meetings, but yet on the other side, having served in several capacities, I know how you can load that up with topics, and quite frankly, that's a real opportunity I see for the committee to really delve into the things they want. And I've also seen it where chairmen have come to management council and said, if you guys get rid of these things, I'm really okay with it. And so I just wonder if there's an opportunity, and if you could share your thoughts on some scenario along that lines that you might consider as part of this conversation.
Sure.
Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Majority Floor Leader, I think that part of the reason that I decided to bring it to the joint rules instead of just finding someone to sponsor it on the Senate side and then running it myself was I like compromise and I like working rules and bills. And so unless it completely gets turned over on its head in this committee, I will probably stand by any compromise version that comes out of joint rules.
Are there any other questions of Representative Yin? Nope. All right, thank you. So I'm going to see if there's any public comment on this proposed rule. Is there any public comment on this proposed rule? Any legislative comment on this proposed rule? Nope. Okay, we're back in, so I'd accept motions on this amendment if anybody wants to move it. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think that the concepts that have been presented are very strong, and I think reworking the language and looking to Senator Hicks' proposal for compromise might get us to the point where we can get behind something. That the language is, as it is now, I think we've identified some concerns that I share, honestly. And so I guess the question is, how long do we want to work here with this group versus how long would we want to work together and put together a joint rule that's proposed in each chamber separately? And I guess I'd just ask the presiding officers what you'd prefer. Do we want to, I'm happy to move this and work it because I like the concepts, but it's not there yet. So I'd take discussion on that, how we want to proceed.
Co-Chair Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, I'm game to go either way. I think it's still a slippery slope, even if you amend it to the topic, because one of the things, and I can tell you, we did it in my committee when I came as corporations, was if you gave me the latitude to have my top two topics, one of them will be so broad that I can include anything under the sun in it. And if they don't have a way to amend it or work on it, and I think there's a certain time that you have to have trust the management council to make good decisions and be smart. That's what they're there for. And I guess if we see abuses appearing on it, they probably should be acted on. But I think exactly what you brought it to light and done it. I would hope that we wouldn't act as a council in a way that goes against that wholesale. So for me, I think the shot's been sent across the bow. It's there, and I would hope we'd be comfortable with somebody calling on it if they're getting out of line. Because once again, they are public meetings, and I think you're going to get treated pretty roughly if you pull off a popular topic just because one person or somebody can convince the group to do it.
Director Obrick.
Mr. Chairman, maybe just for the joint committee's education on this topic, but when we changed the interim committee submittal process, I think it was 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, before the start of the 2017 general session, 6 years ago, there was a letter sent out from the presiding officers, the chairman and vice chairman of management council, stating that they would leave the top three choices of the committees in place if they're reasonable, and they may reprioritize based on management council's directive. Each presiding officer since that time, the last three, have sent the same letter with that same stipulation to all the chairmen. So But I also understand, Senator Rothfuss mentioned at a Senate Rules meeting that there's really nothing more painful than that interim committee topic selection meeting, but yeah, that specific meeting. But that has been the pledge of leadership for at least the last 6 years.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks. When we discussed this in the Senate rules earlier today, the concern I had with the A provision, and having perhaps the top 3 topics accepted is if the education committee that I serve on decides it wants to do a study on sage grouse, as an example, and that's their top priority for whatever reason, that doesn't make it reasonable, right? I mean, the education committee probably shouldn't have sage grouse as a top priority. Yeah. So that gets back to the reasonability standard, and then how is that judged? But at the same time, if the top 3 education priorities are related to the K-12 school system, for example, and directly tie into education, then there's a circumstance where what Representative Yin is proposing in the A paragraph now makes sense. Yeah, leave it alone. These are education priorities, and they're all reasonable. In the past, and at times while I've served on the Management Council, we've stripped off priorities that have been down the center of the plate of a committee because the collective we, not necessarily the me of the we, didn't want those studied. And that, I think, is what Representative Yin is getting towards. So I think it's worth us spending some time before we vote on the joint rules, trying to work up maybe some language that codifies in rule what Director Obrecht said that's now going into the letter, that maybe we can find a way to make it clear that we're deferring to the top 3 priorities, so long as they're consistent with the purpose of the given committee, and then also maybe try and come up with something to preclude defunding, because I think the intent is a rational intent, even if the language is not there. So my suggestion personally would be to maybe push pause, get a little working group together of folks that are interested, and try and put together something that meets all of the interests that we've heard. And if there are more interests, I'd like to hear those before we start getting together, or just pull those people into a working group. I'm happy to work on that working group as well.
Chairman Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, I'm in favor of that. I will pledge that I'll sign off on the letter that's been there, and if we want to do a little revision on it, I think we can probably buy ourselves a year just by getting the letter in line and done, and I'm more than willing. If you got heartburn with it, we'll work on it, but I think the intent's pure of what this was for, and I can tell you I will sign a letter that falls within that intent.
Mr. Speaker.
Senator.
Mr. Speaker, Chairman, Matt, what's the guidelines? Isn't there a period of time that we have to adopt joint rules?
By Monday at close of day, 5 o'clock?
Yeah. Close of business or close of the session on the 5th legislative day,
Which is Monday.
Monday.
Yep, Monday. So are there any motions on this amendment, this rule amendment? Nope. All right, we'll lay that aside. Are there any other amendments to be heard? Any other business before this? Senator Rothfuss?
Well, I do have a question, because we have in our packet amendment to the joint rules, which refers to the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures. I understand that we're going to push pause on revision to the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures for a couple of weeks, but this rule we need to change now unless we're going to suspend rules and amend it with a 2/3 later. So I guess my question is, do we need to endorse or act upon what we see as this joint rules of the Senate and House of Representatives 10-1 is amended to read, and then you see some modification? I'd ask Director Obrecht if I'm tracking correctly there, and we need to act on it now.
Director Obrecht?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so that proposed amendment was forwarded by Management Council to the Joint Rules Committee. It clarifies that changes to the manual shall be made only by a majority vote of the members of the Senate. and the House of Representatives voting separately. Previously, it said that changes shall only be made with the consent of the Rules Committee of the Senate and the House. Didn't specify the vote needed to. This conforms to the existing requirements in Senate Rule 1-1 to changes to the manual. I think, Senator, the House decided to hold off on their conforming rules amendment, either to do it by 2/3 vote after the rules are adopted or wait for the next legislature to do it. And I think that was the thinking on the joint rule as well. So that means that if you decide to approve the manual, they'll just need the consent of the Rules Committee when we do that.
So Senator, we just decided to leave the conforming rules alone. It's not that big a deal. We can clean it up. If we get the manual amended by both bodies, we can clean that up the next session if we need to conform any rules. I don't think it's an issue. Within the manual itself, it talks about a majority vote. And so,
Mr. Chairman, but
Senator,
within the manual, it says a majority vote, but we'd be adopting that, and then you see that this would allow changes to this manual to be made only with the consent of the Rules Committees of the Senate and House. So it's a lower standard. So we're saying in the Manual of Procedures that you have to amend the Manual of Procedures with the consent of each chamber voting separately, unless you read the rules, which says that we can do it with a simple majority of each of the Rules Committees voting separately, I think.
Mr. Chairman?
Director Obrecht? Okay. Senator?
No, I concur with that. And so to me, the issue here is does everybody in the legislature get a vote on changes to the manual? Or is it just the Rules Committee in the House and just the Rules Committee in the Senate? Because that manual does affect every single member. I would like a larger participation, that everybody gets an opportunity to vote on that versus just the Rules Committee. And so that's, to me, that's the meat of the amendment is now, that's all it does. It says, do you want your House Rules Committee just voting on changes to the manual, or you want the whole House? Same with the Senate.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with the way this is drafted right now to go ahead, and if we're inclined, I would make a motion to adopt Joint Rule 10-1 because I think it affords an opportunity for every member of the legislature to vote on the manual.
Is there a second?
I'll second it, Mr. Speaker.
It's been moved and seconded.
And
Director Obrecht?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator?
I'm having a hard time following the discussion. I thought that you just got done saying that the House decided to postpone this determination.
Senator, the House's recommendation to this body was to postpone. We didn't pass or defeat anything. We're simply met and made a recommendation to joint rules that we were going to leave it alone.
Well, in the spirit of the rules being joint, I'd be willing to defer to that recommendation from the House. I don't know what the reason is, but I'm sure there's a good one, and whatever discussions need to happen on the House should happen. I don't feel like we should push this through at this time.
So, Senator, I think we can have that discussion. It's Director Obrecht?
Just so we're clear, the last time the manual was actually voted on, and it was voted on by both the House and the Senate, and that's 2008, and this rule was in place. So the way I read this rule in conjunction with Senate Rule 1-1 in the historic practice of the House and Senate is that any change to the manual which comes from Management Council has to be made with the consent of the Rules Committee, but then also with the majority vote of the Senate and the House. Senate Rule 1-1 obviously requires that. And I think House practice, precedent, and also its place in the procedural authority would require that as well. So this, I don't know if I would call it a true cleanup amendment, but it is a clarification of historic practice and the current.
Senator?
okay, in that case, and I appreciate that clarification. So 1-1, regardless, is going to call upon the majority vote of each chamber. This adds the fact that any changes will require the consent of the Rules Committees of each. So you basically have a stack there. You need to get the Rules Committee's consent and then the chamber consent. So even if we don't change this, we'll require the chambers.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's right.
Okay.
And I would even say that though I struck the with the consent of the Rules Committee of the Senate and House, when I added by majority vote, I'm not sure that you don't want to leave with the consent of the Rules Committee when you add majority vote. That's just clear that any change would need to be vetted through this body first.
Let's
Senator?
withdraw our motion. Yeah, okay. I withdraw my second.
Fair enough. Are there any other motions on any other amendments to the joint rules? Is there any other business before joint rules? Not, we'll stand adjourned.